Hello, my name is Mark Squires. I'll be leading you through hazard communication training today, including some of the changes that have occurred known as the globally harmonized system of chemical classification and labeling. The purpose, rights, and requirements under the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard include some of the new requirements we're going to discuss during this training today: hazard identification and recognition. We'll discuss some of your facility-specific hazards, as well as how we address non-routine tasks, which typically have a higher rate of incidence because of non-familiarity. We'll discuss chemical hazard classification, as well as the difference between health hazards versus our physical hazards. We'll review some methods for hazard control, understanding chemical exposure limits and controls, labeling of hazardous chemicals, safety data sheets, training systems, and program effectiveness. So how do you know if a chemical hazard may be present at your facility? We have a few ways here to identify hazards. First off, previous experience. Have you worked with this material before? What happened then? Any type of prior training that you have received with regards to chemical safety, whether it be formal or on the job. Being aware to what's in your work area. Visual observation, such as, is there a chemical spill? Are there fumes coming off of a welding task? Placards, shipping papers, and finally warning labels are all tools that can be utilized to help identify hazards in your work environment. So let's test your hazard identification skills. What do we see here? We have on the left, you see we have an old Pepsi container that is clearly not filled with Pepsi. Not sure what's in the right-hand Pepsi container, but it definitely looks like there's some sediment down at the bottom there. And finally, in the foreground, we have a squirt bottle with no chemical label on it. So we can never utilize food containers for storage of chemicals. This can lend itself to accidental ingestion of materials, which isn't that uncommon of an occurrence. So we need to make sure we have all of our chemicals stored in proper containers and that they are, in fact, labeled. Here on this slide, we see a gentleman applying a floor coating to the floor. What type of hazards may be present here? Well, floor coating may have hazardous ingredients in it. Is there sufficient ventilation to alleviate the vapors that may be forming as the floor coating dries? And are there specific personal protective equipment requirements? Would the worker need to wear a respirator? And finally, what do we see here? The top left corner of this image, you see an emergency eye wash station that is blocked by drums of hazardous waste. Emergency equipment such as eye washes, fire extinguishers, emergency exits, all need to be maintained free and clear at all times so that when an emergency would arise, we can easily and readily access those bits of emergency equipment. So, what other non-chemical hazards may be present in your facility? While hazard communication specifically addresses chemical safety, it also addresses those hazards that may not be directly a result from a liquid or a solid chemical. Some examples of non-chemical hazards found in W.W. Williams sites include ultraviolet light, which may be a result of excessive exposure to sunlight. As we know, sunlight causes sunburn. Excessive sunburn repeatedly over the years can eventually lead to skin cancer. Sunlight is a form of non-ionizing radiation, as is the ultraviolet light that's produced during arc welding. We have mechanical hazards. such as moving or rotating machinery that may be encountered while we are servicing equipment. There may be ergonomic hazards, forcing your body into an awkward position, conducting repetitive motions that may lead to workplace musculoskeletal injuries. There may be electrical hazards, especially for your generator technicians, who all should be trained in the requirements of NFPA 70E. There are noise hazards, which may be present in your engine dynos, your transmission dynos. It's pretty loud in those rooms. There may be biological hazards presented by servicing garbage trucks. You never know what you're going to encounter in the back of one of those. And while your scope of maintenance doesn't really focus in that area, it may be a form of collateral risk. And finally, hot and cold hazards. Environmentally, in the summertime, in a lot of your sites, it gets hot. At least up here in the Midwest in the wintertime, it gets pretty cold as well. And finally, you have to worry about hot vehicle components, your engines, your exhaust systems, your hot liquids, your oils, your coolants, etc. So those are all examples of non-chemical hazards that may be present at your facility. So some examples of non-routine tasks that may be present at W.W. Williams sites would be, for example, we have some downtime, slow day. We're looking to do some routine maintenance, or rather non-routine maintenance, such as painting the shop, performing cleaning tasks. So how do we handle these tasks? Again, as I had mentioned in one of the opening slides, non-routine tasks typically lend themselves to higher injury rates while being performed because task familiarity isn't there. Some ways that we can reduce the risk associated with performing a non-routine task include planning out the job, performing an assessment of the hazards of that task, referencing work procedures that may be already in place, such as lockout, tagout protocol, utilizing the proper equipment and materials for the job, as opposed to utilizing makeshift equipment that may not really be designed for the purpose that we're using it for, briefing employees prior to starting work, getting supervisors involved. Typically, supervisors have a bit of experience under their belt that they may be able to shed some insight into the hazards that aren't readily obvious. And finally, once the task is complete, conduct an after-action review. What went wrong? What went right? How do we proceed with this again in the future should this task come up? So much like non-routine tasks, when we bring a new material, a new chemical into the workplace, we need to go through some of those same processes to ensure that the material or that chemical isn't going to cause harm. So it starts with awareness. What'd you know? Methods that we can utilize, again, labels, shipping papers, material safety data sheets. How do we recognize hazards? Examples of hazards include physical hazards, such as corrosives, flammables, health hazards, such as eyes, lungs, skin hazards. How do we properly assess the risk? Utilizing those bits of information and the guidelines provided by the manufacturer is a really good start. And take precautions and use available controls, such as exhaust systems, personal protective equipment, and the like. The end goal by performing these assessments prior to working with materials and ensuring that employees are properly trained is to prevent you from looking like our friend here off on the right-hand side of the screen. He isn't aware, and so as a result, he is not taking the proper controls in order to keep himself safe. He's not wearing personal protective equipment. He doesn't have a respirator. He's not aware, and so as a result, he may not wind up sleeping very well at night due to potential health effects. May wind up actually in the hospital while out there looking for what we suspect to be possibly his golf ball. While these other employees who have the proper controls in place are likely going to go home. They're going to sleep fine. So, specific chemicals in our plant. What operations in our facility involve potential chemical exposure? Most of these are technicians that are on the shop floor that are exposed to a variety of different materials, including solvents, fuels and fuel additives, oils and lubricants, aerosols, coolants, cleaners, adhesives, detergents, corrosives, inert gases, oxidizers, spill response materials, metal fumes and dust, toxics, refrigerants, asbestos, urea, and silica are all common items in most W.W. Williams shops. A copy of the Hazard Communication Program is available in your site CSM's office inside of the U.S. Compliance Manual. So with regards to chemical exposure, once we perform that initial basic assessment of chemicals when they're brought into our workplace, when we start digging a little deeper, there's a few more things that we need to take into consideration with regards to how they may potentially affect us. This includes, what is the means of exposure for a particular material? How can it get into our body? How much of it are we working with? How often and for how long are we working with that material? And what is the probability of that material being introduced into our body? Is it a closed loop system or an open system? So, with regards to routes of entry, there are 5 primary methods that a material may get from our work environment into our bodies. The first one, and the most prominent one, is inhalation. As humans, we need to breathe in order to survive, and our lungs do a great job of taking what we breathe in and putting it into our bodies. That's good when we're talking about air, because air contains oxygen, which we need to survive. However, it's not good when we're talking about smoke, dusts, mists, and other airborne particulate that may wind up being inhaled. The next route of entry is ingestion. Materials can be ingested typically one of 2 ways, one of which we already discussed when we found some sort of a chemical inside of a foodstuff container. Accidental ingestion, because we are improperly storing chemicals, can occur. Additionally, failure to wash hands before eating, drinking, or smoking can also lead to the ingestion of chemicals, metal particulates, greases, oils, etc. If we are not properly rinsing those items off of our hands before eating, which can transfer the materials onto our food stuff and into our body, drinking, or smoking can lead to ingestion of workplace materials. Our third route of entry is absorption. Absorption occurs when a material has what is called a skin designation, in that it can easily penetrate through our skin by stripping away the oils, which are essentially our protective coating. Examples of materials that can readily absorb into our body are a lot of your solvents that are out there, whether it be parts washer solvents, brake part cleaners, etc. The fourth method of injection is relatively self-explanatory. Rather, the fourth route of entry, being injection, is relatively self-explanatory. If there is a material that is contaminated with workplace chemicals, such as a utility blade, which may have greases, adhesives, etc. on it, it may potentially, if you were to cut yourself, deposit those items directly into our bloodstream. Finally, the last route of entry is our mucous membranes. When we're talking about chemical safety, really the mucous membrane that is most susceptible is our eyes. Materials such as corrosives are extremely damaging to our eyes in a very short period of time, which is why, like we saw a few slides back with the blocked emergency eye wash, it's important that we have those free and clear access at all times, as there are areas of your facility, such as steam bays, that utilize corrosive additives to the wash wands. So what we have here is the dose-response effect. And the dose-response effect is very similar to a cause and effect. The amount of material taken into the body relative to the level of toxicity of that specific material is going to dictate the response. We need water to live. However, it is possible that you can actually drink too much water to the point where your body is no longer able to perform basic functions such as breathing, and you would wind up passing away as a result. 2 Tylenol because you have a headache, probably do the job. That's a safe dose. However, if you were to consume an entire bottle of Tylenol, you're likely going to wind up in the hospital having your stomach pumped because it was an overdose. So while medicines, for example, have set doses right on the container, it's not always so easy to determine exactly what safe limits exist for chemicals in the workplace. That's what our material safety data sheets are there to provide, basic information on safe chemical exposure limits. Just like anything, we can be safely exposed to some chemicals in the workplace repeatedly, day in and day out, and as long as they don't exceed a specific level, there should be no negative repercussions on your health. The most common exposure limit you're going to find is called a permissible exposure level, also known as a PEL. This is a measure of a concentration of a chemical vapor or a dust in the air, which will be measured in milligrams per cubic meter or parts per million. So we're talking about a concentration here that it's the maximum you could be exposed to on average over an 8-hour workday, what we call the time-weighted average, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, for 40 years, and you never have any negative health effects. Very similar to that permissible exposure limit is what we call the threshold limit value, or the TLV. The concept of this is the exact same as the permissible exposure level. The difference between the two is the permissible exposure level is an OSHA-regulated standard. This is a legal maximum limit, whereas your threshold limit value is more of a best management practice set forth by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. The third value we have here is your short-term exposure limit, or the STEL. If a task or a job requires short bursts of exposure or durations 15 minutes or less, OSHA sets limits that says you can be exposed up to X concentration for up to 15 minutes a day, for up to 15 minutes at a time, up to 4 times per day. As long as you have an hour-long break between each exposure, there should be no ill effect. The next exposure limit is immediately dangerous to life and health, also known as the IDLH value. If a chemical were to be introduced into your work environment at an IDLH value, it is the level that you would have approximately 30 minutes to identify that the chemical is present and to evacuate the area before fatalities start occurring. It's not always that easy to determine whether or not that material is present because, for example, byproducts of vehicle exhaust such as carbon monoxide, there is no smell. There is no visual clues. We don't know it exists until the effects start occurring to our bodies. Finally, the ceiling limit, also abbreviated as C, is the maximum concentration that a worker can ever be exposed to regardless of the level of personal protective equipment they're wearing. So even if we have suits, as you see in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, that still isn't going to potentially stop the effects of that chemical. So under OSHA's revised hazard communication standard, there is a requirement for standardized hazard classification. And the goal of this is to ensure that you don't just know what the potential effects of the material are, but that you also understand what those hazards are. As a part of the revised standard, OSHA has set forth an appendix for hazard classification. And what this is designed to do is it's designed to ensure consistent evaluation and assessment of chemicals so that we have warning labels that match up from one material manufacturer to another that is making the same product. Think of it as if it were a nutrition facts label on a food product. The nutrition facts labels are virtually ubiquitous. Everything except for really water bottles has one of these nutrition facts labels on it. And they are set up the same way for all food products. It lists your serving size, your calories, calories from fat, fat content and a breakdown of it, your protein, your carbohydrates, etc. It's standardized, and that helps us understand exactly what it is we're putting into our bodies. 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't the standard. Food manufacturers were still required to place that information on a food container, but they were able to utilize whatever means that they felt were appropriate. And so you had a wide variety of labeling methods, which was not conducive to helping the consumer understand what they were putting into our systems. So we have two primary categories of hazard classification. We have health hazards and we have physical hazards. And then those hazards are further broken down into hazard classes and hazard categories. With regards to health hazards, some examples of hazard classes you will find under this category are acute toxicity, which means a very short exposure can cause serious repercussions, skin corrosion or irritation, serious eye damage or eye irritation, material that may cause sensitization of our respiratory tract or our skin, germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogens, teratogens, materials that cause reproductive toxicity, specific single target organ toxicity, or aspiration hazards. Some examples of physical hazard classes are explosives, flammables, oxidizers, self-reactives, hydrofluorics, self-heating materials, organic peroxides, materials that are corrosive to metals, and gases that are under pressure. So one of the bedrocks of hazard communication is ensuring that all chemical containers maintain a label. Oftentimes, this is achieved by simply maintaining a chemical in its primary container. That container which is provided from the manufacturer that has the manufacturer-specific instructions on it. What we're going to see here over the course of the next few years as the globally harmonized system of chemical classification and labeling is implemented is a lot of your primary containers, your drums, your buckets, etc., are going to start to include GHS label elements. Again, that GHS stands for the Globally Harmonized System. As we work our way through the balance of this PowerPoint presentation, we'll discuss what some of those elements are. We also have the Hazard Materials Identification System, also known as HMIS, the NFPA 704 diamond, NFPA standing for the National Fire Protection Association. Those last two I mentioned we'll discuss on the next few slides. Additionally, when we receive materials in that require it, you will find DOT placards on your bulk containers as well as on the transport vehicle, and your individual containers such as drums or buckets will have labels on them, a small DOT equivalent to the placard. So for your raw materials, your drums, your buckets, etc., chemical labels will now contain the following key points. First, you will have a product identifier, which basically says what this chemical is. We will have a signal word, such as warning or danger. There will be pictograms. As you can see, the red boxes at the top of the example label here, which we will go through at the end of this presentation. There is a hazard statement where it says what it can potentially do to you. And then finally, there is a precautionary statement which states what you can do to keep yourself safe while working with that material. So taking that a little bit more in depth, the product identifier is a name or number which is used to identify the chemical on the label. The signal word, warning versus dangerous, they mean different items, and there's going to be a level of consistency across the board with regards to this. Your pictogram, there's one of 9 pictograms. They will always have a red box, always have a black and white picture on the inside. A hazard statement, description of the hazard class, and that precautionary statement, what we can do to minimize adverse reactions. And here's another example of a GHS compliant label. And you can see all those different elements on here that we had just talked about. So, all of our secondary containers, meaning we took an item out of a primary container and we put it into a secondary container. They must be identified. What we have here is an example GHS secondary containment label. And what you see is the 2 pictograms, a description of the material, a warning statement. Now, current systems are okay under new GHS rules, but be aware that some of the numbering with regards to GHS is actually inverse of your NFPA and your HMIS systems that are currently in use. So with your NFPA 704 diamond, we have a blue box that refers to the health hazard, red box that refers to your fire hazard, yellow box that relates to instability, and those 3 boxes, the 3 of color, are rated on a scale of 0 to 4. 0 being a minimal hazard with relation to that category, 4 being an extreme hazard with relation to that category. Finally, that white box down at the bottom, you will find specific hazard information if it applies to that material. Oftentimes, if it doesn't apply, this will simply just be a blank box. And you can see some examples of the symbols that you would find in there: oxidizers, acids, alkalines, corrosives, water reactive, and radioactive materials. And here we have the HMIS labeling system. For all intents and purposes, your health, your flammability, and your reactivity are pretty much the same as your NFPA diamond, in that it's rated on a scale of 0 to 4. 0 being the minimal hazard, 4 being an extreme hazard in each respective category. Instead of having a specific hazard identifier in the white box, your HMIS system has a protective equipment code, which if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see there are a variety of letters as well as pictograms depicting what type of personal protective equipment we should be utilizing while working with that chemical. So your safety data sheets, typically and historically, these are known as material safety data sheets. As the law was updated, they dropped the word material from the term safety data sheets, so now they are just SDSs. This is due to reflect the consistency that is going to be applied to these safety data sheets. Most W.W. Williams sites maintain a copy of these on the shop floor. Oftentimes there's an MSDS station or a cabinet where the MSDS binder is located. It is your right to know and understand what is contained inside of that book. If you are not aware of the location where these are stored, please ask your supervisor to direct you to those. They need to be free and accessible to you at all times. Inside of that binder, you will find a safety data sheet chemical listing, which essentially serves as an index of all the safety data sheets listed inside of that binder. Now, under the new GHS requirements, there will be 16 specific sections inside of each material or each safety data sheet. Just as I mentioned with regards to nutrition facts, it's going to be set up the same way for every material. They need to be provided in the workplace for all hazardous chemicals, and it helps you understand what the hazards are by providing basic information. As we had discussed earlier during the initial chemical assessment slide, they need to be reviewed before initially being put into use, and they are also updated on an ongoing basis. As the chemical manufacturer makes changes, periodically your site should be requisitioning those sheets to ensure that they have the most up-to-date information available. So what we see here are these 16 sections that you will find on those safety data sheets. Currently, if you were to open your safety data sheet book, you would find some sheets that are 1 page, some that are 10 pages. And there's no real level of consistency with what information can be found where. That is going to be coming to an end because these sections that you see on this slide will consistently be listed on every single safety data sheet. So let's go through the different sections and see exactly what they're going to contain. Section 1 is identification. It's going to list the same product identifiers that you find on your chemical container label. It will list the manufacturer, address of the manufacturer, contact information from the manufacturer, number to call in the event of an emergency related to that chemical, what it is designed to be used for, and what it should not be used for. Section 2 is hazard identification. Here we are going to find basic hazards regarding the chemical. A lot of the components on your chemical container labels will be found in this section, to include your required label elements such as pictograms that you can see in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. Again, we'll review those towards the end of this presentation. Section 3, composition, information on chemical ingredients. Again, relating it back to the food, information you find on a cereal box or a can of soda, it's going to list what the ingredients are. Now, also much like your can of soda or your box of cereal, you're often going to find generic items, trade secret claims, kind of like your natural flavors, natural colors. There's all types of stuff in there. but it's a trade secret. They're not just going to release that information to anyone because then their product could essentially be duplicated. Section 4 is first aid information. This is going to give you important information with regards to symptoms of overexposure to that material and effects. It's going to list what the short-term effects may be, what the long-term effects may be, and what the required treatment is per the respective route of entry. Section 5 is your firefighting measures. What we are going to find in this section is, if there's a fire, what do we do to put it out? Suitable extinguishing techniques, basic equipment that should be maintained on hand, and what are some of the hazards, chemical-wise, that could be produced in the event of a fire? Step 6, accidental release measures. What happens if we spill it? Here we will find basic emergency procedures, proper spill response equipment, methods of cleanup and containment, and what type of treatment should be required for those items. Section 7, handling and storage, basic precautions, what the material may be incompatible with. Section 8, your exposure controls and recommended personal protective equipment. So here we will find what those safe limits are for your time-weighted average in the form of PELs and TLBs. What are the appropriate engineering controls, such as do we need an exhaust system installed for this unit while we're using a specific chemical, and what are the PPE requirements. Section 9, properties. List the chemical characteristics as well as the physical characteristics of the chemical. Boiling point, freezing point, specific gravity, vapor density, etc. Section 10 is stability and reactivity. It lists whether the material is stable and what are the possibility of hazardous reactions. Section 11 is the last section of this safety data sheet that is regulated specifically by OSHA. The format through sections 1 through 16 is all mandated. However, the contents are only up to section 11 explicitly required by OSHA. Beyond this, you're going to find other branches of government, such as the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Transportation. They get to have their information posted on here as well. So section 11 is toxicological information. What is the potential route of exposure? What are some of the related symptoms? What are the acute and chronic effects? And what are some of the numerical measures of toxicity? Section 12, ecological information, is not regulated by OSHA, but rather the EPA. And here we will find the potential impact on the environment or specific ecosystems such as marine life. Section 13, disposal considerations, is also regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. And here we will find basic information for what we need to do if we need to throw this material away. Not everything can just wind up in the dumpster. Certain materials, such as flammables, corrosives, reactives, and toxics, are all regulated as hazardous waste. Section 14 is transport information, regulated by the DOT, and this is where we will find basic information such as how we package it for shipment, how we need to mark the box, how we need to label the container, and how we would need to placard the transport vehicle. Section 15 is regulatory information. Again, not regulated by OSHA, but this is where we will find basic compliance considerations, such as whether you need to obtain a permit to utilize more than X quantity of that material at your facility. And Section 16, other miscellaneous information. Data preparation, last revision, other basic information, administrative items related to that safety data sheet. So those are the 16 sections of your new safety data sheet. Now, some basic rules to live by when it comes to chemical safety include ensuring all chemical containers are properly labeled, making sure we keep the containers closed when they are not being used, return all chemicals to the proper storage location at the end of each shift, do not mix chemicals, report all spills immediately, wear proper personal protective equipment when handling hazardous chemicals, storing chemicals in a cool, dry place away from employee traffic areas, minimizing work around chemical storage areas, as well as minimizing smoking in those areas, especially around flammables. Do not eat or drink while using hazardous chemicals, and be sure to wash your hands again before eating, drinking, or smoking. Now, the 9 pictograms you are going to start to see appear over the next few years on your chemical containers and on your safety data sheets are found below. These include health hazards, flammability hazards, exclamation marks, materials under pressure, corrosives, exploding bombs, flame over circles, environmental hazards, and the skull and crossbones. So let's talk about each one of these individually. The exploding bomb. What this means is that material may be potentially explosive, self-reactive, or some organic peroxides also have this criteria applied to it. Basic precautions include handling precautions. Some explosives are extremely sensitive to vibration. There may be maximum storage quantities for these materials within your facility, and especially when it comes to your organic peroxides, there may be a potential corrosive hazard associated with these. Examples of materials that may wind up receiving this designation once assigned include your supplemental restraint systems, such as airbags, the ones in the steering wheels, not the ones in the suspension, and pretensioners in seatbelts. This is your flame. What this means is the material is either flammable, it may emit flammable gas, it is a self-reactive substance, it may ignite upon contact with air, also known as pyrophoric, it is a self-heating substance, or, again, falling into this category, maybe organic peroxide. Basic precautions for flammable materials. We need to store it properly. All WW Williams sites should have a flammable material storage cabinet that we want to store the majority of all not in use flammable containers inside of. When transferring materials, such as dispensing a solvent from a drum, we want to practice safe transfer by grounding and bonding in order to prevent the accumulation of static electricity, which could generate a spark, hence igniting flammable vapors. We may be required to have specific equipment in the environment, such as fire extinguishers, and we want to make sure that ambient temperatures aren't excessive in areas where this is stored. There's a WW Williams field service truck that a technician, while on a field call, left an aerosol can of some sort of flammable material sitting on the back bumper. In the hot sun, the can wound up overheating, a leak developed, and the actual escape of hazardous vapors wound up generating enough static electricity to ignite those vapors as they escape. So some examples of flammable materials at your sites include brake parts cleaner, acetylene, propane, and natural gas. The flame over circle. What this pictogram means is that that material is an oxidizer. It isn't necessarily a fuel per se. However, if introduced into a fire, it may generate or generate oxygen, which will accelerate the fire. We need to store oxygen properly. Minimally compressed oxygen and compressed flammables need to be minimally 20 feet apart from one another in storage. We want to avoid skin and eye contact, and there may be a potential inhalation hazard associated with oxygen. Too much oxygen can actually make you sick, mixed with the fact that the oxygen you're using in your shops for oxy-fuel welding is not the same grade of oxygen you would find in a medical setting. Gas cylinders is what this pictogram means. This indicates that the material is a compressed gas, a liquefied gas, or a dissolved gas. Basic precautions include secure gas cylinders at all times to prevent tipping over and rupturing. Utilize safety caps when not in use. Be alert to some physical hazards associated with the cylinders, and ensure you're utilizing the proper personal protective equipment, as a lot of these gases are extremely cold when under pressure and may cause frost burns. Examples of gas cylinder classified items at your site include LPG, acetylene, inert cover gases, as well as a variety of aerosol cans. This symbol, much like the DOT label, is for corrosives. What this means is that it can cause damage to your skin, your eyes, and materials in your workplace, including metals. Basic precautions include preventing skin and eye contact, wearing chemical-resistant PPE, and we need to ensure that due to the potential for violent reactions, we always add corrosives to water if necessary to dilute. Never add water to corrosives. Examples of corrosive materials at your site include battery acids, steam cleaner solutions, as well as battery terminal cleaner. Skull and crossbones means that there is an acute toxicity associated with this material, meaning that it may be fatal or toxic even if ingested or taken into the body through other routes of entry in only small doses. Basic precautions: never ingest or inhale anything that has an acute toxicity. Proper hygiene is vital, such as washing your hands, making sure to wear the PPE and respirators recommended by the chemical manufacturer, proper storage, and ensuring that we have proper ventilation. Examples of materials that would receive this pictogram include carbon monoxide from vehicle exhaust. Our pictogram here represents the starburst in the middle of a human bust silhouette. What this means, there is a long-term health hazard associated with it, meaning it may cause cancer, may cause cell mutations, reproductive toxicity, sensitization of the respiratory tract. There may be a target organ toxicity or an aspiration hazard. Basic precautions include, first and foremost, hygiene. Again, making sure washing your hands before eating, drinking, or smoking, wearing your proper PPE and respirator when required. And really, this is an item that you want to reference the original manufacturer label and or safety data sheet, because there may be some specific requirements that you need to take into consideration. Examples of materials that may have a health hazard designation include the old fluorinated brake parts cleaners, which some of your sites may still have sitting around, even though they're being phased out. Asbestos from older brake pads, and silica dust from newer brake pads. The exclamation mark here is kind of somewhere in between the skull and crossbones acute toxicity and the health hazard of the human bust starburst silhouette. This is kind of a generic item that is assigned to materials that contain a variety of properties, such as irritants, skin sensitizers, narcotic effects, target organ toxicity, or hazardous to the ozone layer. Precautions vary so widely from materials that carry this pictogram that we need to reference the manufacturer's information. Some examples would include solvents and fuels. And finally, the only pictogram that has not formally been adopted by OSHA, because OSHA does not have jurisdiction over environmental hazardous materials, include this environmental toxicity, where we have our dead fish, dead tree, meaning that's extremely hazardous to the environment. Precautions: we need to dispose of chemicals in an environmentally responsible, wet manner, follow EPA regulations on use and storage, and reference the safety data sheets of chemicals used for proper disposal. Examples of materials that are hazardous to the environment include your refrigerants that you find in your air conditioning and refrigeration systems. Lastly, we have hazards not otherwise classified. Even with all those categories, there are some materials that don't necessarily fit nicely into any of them. That includes combustible dust, simple asphyxiants such as argon, nitrogen, carbon dioxide. Some basic precautions we want to put into place. As it relates to W.W. Williams, especially with your asphyxiants, we should be using those in a well-ventilated area because those gases can displace oxygen and cause suffocation. So effective dates regarding the implementation of the GHS requirement. The first effective date is December 1st, 2013, where OSHA requires that employers train employees on the new label elements and safety data sheet format, which we have now concluded. As of June 1st, 2015, compliance with all modified provisions of this rule must be met. Basically, the safety data sheet should be updated, your labels should be updated, and as of December 1st of 2015, a chemical importer or distributor shall not ship containers labeled by the chemical manufacturer or importer unless it contains the GHS element. By June 1st of 2016, updated alternative workplace labeling and hazard communication program must be completed, and additional employee training for newly identified physical or health hazards must be conducted. June 1st of 2016 is the final deadline related to the implementation of the GHS requirements of the new hazard communication standard. So in conclusion, be alert to some of these changes that we discussed today as it relates to the globally harmonized system of chemical classification and labeling. If you haven't already, you will start to see some of these elements that we discussed here, such as chemical labels and safety data sheets, start to appear in your workplace. If you're not sure, always ask, use caution, and never take shortcuts when working with chemicals. Follow the basic safety procedures reviewed in this training. And when it comes to chemical safety, it is paramount that you adhere to the manufacturer's requirements. And it is your right to know, and it is also your right to understand. My name is Mark Squires, Environmental Health and Safety Advisor for U.S. Compliance. Thanks for participating in this training. There is a short quiz that you will now be asked to complete.